So we're just saying this, Lo Yiranya Adam L'chai, how could it be that that a person could see HaKadosh Baruch Hu and continue living, so to speak? So one of the answers is with the Chinas Bittul Mamash. I was explaining in the Bittul by way of a story from the Rebbe, where the Rebbe explains Eliyahu Novi, that Eliyahu Novi had one of the keys, the key for Geshem. And a woman came to him and asked for a refuah for her child, and he wanted to give her a bracha, but the Baruch told him you can't give him the bracha until you give him back the key. You can only take one key at a time. Yet we see by the Rebbeim that they, Shem Tov and all the Rebbeim, that they had all three keys at the same time. The Rebbe explains that it was Bechinas Bittul. And it was not that they had the key and they were in charge of the key. What Eliyahu was doing was he was preventing the rain from happening. He wasn't causing the rain to happen, he was preventing it from happening. Therefore, you could only have one key. But if you mashpia the brachas directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the tzino, so to speak, but bechinas bittul mamish, then you can have all of the keys, and that's bechinas misasam, but misasam royim. In other words, bechinas bottle v'or min ha'olam ben mea. And kilu bottle of over oilam is that they're not there. There's no ego involved. There's no them there, so to speak. And therefore, afilu b'chayehem royim, as we see. That's why the Maimah Chazal is it's only keilu meis. Zeu keilu meis. Uinyan b'misatan royim uinyan oilamcha tireh b'chayecha, that you will see your Oilam, in other words, Oilam Haba, Tereh B'chayecha, you'll see even when you're alive. How could that be? This is talking about Tzadikim Gedolim, and afilu people who maybe not Tzadikim Gedolim, but are Balam B'sirus Nefesh, that are able to see the Inyan of Oilam Haba, afilu B'chayecha. V'hainu, and this is what he means when he says, Yoyso bin Mea Shana. When a person is 100 years old, she is in other words, not dafka that is actually 100 years old in age, but it's only that we explained before that Yechidois is the union of single numbers, is the union of lower madrigas, that's against Malchus, and then Malchus and so on, and then Asiriois are Chochma and Bina, and then Maya is in Kesar. There's different ways of explaining it as well. Maya could also be Chochma and Bina. But in any event, that's the way he explained it here. And he brought two shit. He brought both shittas actually. And we have to come to this through the Indian of Shivim Shana. In other words, the person cannot be Meir Shana until it comes to Shivim Shana. But it becomes notifications. Okay, let's continue. McDonald begin Shivim Shana. The Meish Noiseinu Bohem who Indian Birur and Nefesh Bahamas. The Meish Noiseinu Bohem Shivim Shana. That's the Indian than Birur the Nefesh Bahamas. Why the Nefesh Bahamas? Because the Nefesh Bahamas ultimately comes from the Indian of Shalom Midos. That's the Indian of Nefesh Bahamas, and therefore to the Mavara the Nefesh Bahamas, which is the 7 Midos, and each Mida is Kalu Mi Esa Matrigas. Therefore, it's the Indian of Shivim Shana. So when a person passes that Indian of Shivim Shana, in other words, when he's done the Birur of Shivim Shana, and again, the Indian of Shivim Shana doesn't necessarily mean age-wise. It's the Birur of Shivim Shana. Like, for example, Arizal himself was niftar only at the age of 39. Then he would reach the age of 40, never mind, the age of 70. But he did all the Birurim very quickly and perhaps in previous Gilgulim. In any event, we see that the Birur and the Nefesh Bahamas, but Derech Klal is called the Indian of Shivim Shana, even though it's not necessarily Shivim Shana. Shalzeh Nikbetzu Yemei Adam, Niktavu Yemei Adam, and for this reason, a person's life is set at Shivim Shana. Why? Shein Keneged Zayin Midos, corresponding to the Zayin Midos. Each Midah. When a person is able to mavar all those midos of the Nefesh Bahamas and the subcategories of the midos, in other words, let's say Chochma of Chesed of Klippa and Bina of Chesed of Klippa, all the 10 madrigas thereof. The Misasan Rain, he's Zoicher that the Misasan, the Misa, in other words, the Misa of the Nefesh Bahamas and then you can see Elokus. And that's why it's called B'maya Shana, the Inyan Kesser, B'chinas Kesser, B'chinas Ribui Ha'or, and that's the Inyan of Ben Meir, Lav Dafka, the Inyan of his age. Okay, Kitzer. V'adug mizel amala the Kli HaChochma hu B'chinas Ayin hu B'chinas Ribui Ha'or. Bina B'chinas Yesh B'chinas Miyut Ha'or, as we explained before. U'ma'alem is ala or HaChochma. Bina is ma'alim and conceals the or of Chochma. Why? Because that's the whole inner keli. And the inner keli is to makabel the or, but at the same time to reduce the or, to hide it. And therefore, la'asid lavo, it will be that when Mashiach comes, v'hein if yadoi al hanahar, he will stretch out his hand over the nahar. What's the nahar? The nahar is the Indian of midrais. The Indian of the midrais. And vehikal lezayin lecholim, and he'll split the river into 7 necholim, 7 streams. In other words, these are the 7 midos that have been purified, that are coming out of the nahar of bina. Okay, so malchus muta, or and in Zeir Anpin Malchus, how much more so if Bina is already a muta, or how much more so the Inyan of Zeir Anpin and Malchus, which are the lower madrigas. Those are the 7 midras. And therefore sometimes you'll find that up above, the higher you go, the lesser the number, and that's talking about the kalim. The fewer kalim there are, the more the oil. But sometimes the Mispar Meruba is spoken about Lamala, that's talking about the or. The Mispar Meruba shows in the Inyan of Riboy Haor, Zuba Oiris. Zeo Ben Meir Shana, that's the Inyan of Ben Meir, Ki Ilu Meis, Hainu, Bitel Hakli, Riboy Haor. It's a Bitel of Kli, it's a Riboy of Or, and that's why it's Bechinas Meir, it's to show the Inyan of Riboy, Lav Dafka, the Inyan of Meir, but the Inyan of Riboy. Lasid, Hanar Ben Meir Sham Ben Meir, Yis Alabatin Sakeser. In the future, even someone of an immature status in Ruchnias will be on such a high madrega that he will be on the madrega of Kesser. And now we go on to Perek Lamed Hay. Just as you have in the Esses in the Malumata, what's Mila? Mila is, in other words, closer to the source, closer to the Riboy or is called Mila. And as the or is hoylech misma'et, further and further down it goes, that's called mata. That's the below, so above and below. Mokanyesh is chalkuz malamata gamba oilemus. So do you have the Indian oilemus as well? In other words, oilem ha'atzilus is going to be the Indian mila, and oilem ha'asiyah is going to be the Indian mata. And what makes it that way? The riboy and mute ha'or. The clouds say Stauschluss Nifchan Begimel Madregas. The entire Seder Stauschluss is divided up into Gimel Madregas. What are these Gimel Madregas? He explains, and Gimel Oilam is Biyah. These are called the Gimel Oilam is Biyah HaKloliim. That's what he means. Here, the Gimel Oilam is Biyah Kloliim. In other words, you have Bria, Yetzir, and Asiya Kloliim. And what are they? Bria the Chlalus, as it's called, Bria the Chlalus is Aron Kadmon. Yetzir the Klalus is Atzilus, and Asiya the Klalus is Biyah, Bria, Yetzir, and Asiya. That's what the Inyan Gimel Oilam is. In other words, that structure of the 3-part structure is sort of expanded outwards so that it becomes more inclusive of higher madrigas. Again, Bria, Adam the Bria, or Bria the Klalus is Olam Adam Kadmoin, Yetzira Atzilus, and Asiya is Biyah. K'mo derech Moshel Adam, and so too Adam, as we're going to use the motion always, he too is divided up into 3 inyonim, klolim, 3 inyonim klolim. And the koiches nefesh, v'heim ba'guf. Whether we're talking about the inner dimension of Adam, in other words, the koiches nefesh, or we talk about simply the Indian of the guf. Very easy to see it in the guf. V'heim rosh v'guf v'regel. There's the head, there's the torso, the guf, and there's the regel, the legs. Right? So what's the regel? The regel is the most chitonius aspect of a person, and it contains the lowest koyach, which is koyach hahiluch, The hands are already a high madrega. We'll speak about that in a minute. And kol shekam kol chaimer, the emotions which are in the heart, which is in the torso, and the inyan of seichel, which is in the head. So you have basically three chilukim. Regel, the torso, the guf, and the rosh. Okay, so as we said, the regel is koach hahiluch, shehu koach hayois achar shebonefesh. The hagam shekoach hahiluch hu kamken l'tzarech hanefesh, even though it's for the sake of the nefesh. In other words, a person who can't just be a head, he has to have legs to be able to take the head where the head wants to go. Right? The head can't take itself there, but the head can make the legs take it there. And there's an advantage of in koach hahiluch. What is it? That shu noises a rosh. Umami does a rosh. It carries the rosh and takes it where it wants to go. And it's mami the rosh. It's the stature of a person, right? If he was just a head, that wouldn't be able to achieve much, right? Nevertheless, it's the lowest koyach of the person's guf. Sure, that the order of the nefesh in the guf, the only thing you have in the legs is the inyan of koyach, strength. Higher koyachos, higher faculties don't really appear very much in the legs. Even though he'll explain that to a certain extent, you do have the inyan of koyach, of higher koyachos in the legs to a certain extent, but nevertheless, on the whole, the legs are the lowest madrega. Ubaguf meir ora nefesh yoser, in guf, in other words, in the torso, the ora nefesh is more than in the legs. Shahari baguf hene vorim pnimium, because the guf contains a vorim pnimium, in other words, the liver and the kidneys and the heart and so on and so forth. Shechayas ha'aram talui bahem, those organs upon which a person's life really depends. A person can chat hasholem do without his legs. We see, unfortunately, with people who were wounded in accidents or in war and things like that, they manage somehow without legs. Masha Ayin Kain, but they're a klal. A person cannot manage without a heart, and without lungs, and without liver, kidneys, and so on. Even though you can get a transplant, but you can see the fact that a person even needs a transplant means that his chayv is tolev there. Right. V'gam b'midah hamidosh b'nefesh mishkan b'leif. That's where they situated in the heart. Now, how do we know that the emotions are situated in the heart? This is old-time medicine. But what it means is not that the midos are there, but that's where they poil. So, for instance, when a person is very scared, so you find his heart is beating at full speed, all right? His heart is beating at full speed. Why? Because the gilui hamidos is in the nefesh, right? I'm sorry, the gilui hamidos is in the guf. That's where it is. That's where the midos mizgala in his heart. When a person is in a state of relaxation, its own heart will beat much more slowly. So we can see from that indeed the midos are mizgala in the guf. And even to a certain extent, the varim chitzonim of the ikka part of the guf, of the torso, for example, the hands, the arms. You have more of a gilu of the nefesh in the hands, in the arms and the hands, than you have in the regel. Like in the hands, writing and painting, etc. To do some kind of skilled work, let's say play music and things like that, that the legs could not possibly do, at least certainly not nearly as well, even though there are people that learn to paint with their feet and play music with their feet, but nevertheless, but that's not the way it is. And certainly they would have to play much simpler music. It's just not possible to get it. In any event, the etzem hakoyach ulamayla mikoyach hiluch. That etzem koyach in the yard is on a higher madrega than koyach hiluch. Even though it's also only Maisa, but nevertheless, because the arms are part of the guf, we see that that's a higher inyan. It transcends the madrega of the regel, which is just ambulance. In other words, to get a person from ambulatory, I think, to get a person from one place to another. And there's also ora seichel in the hand. In order to be able to draw and to write and so on and so forth, as As is required, obviously there is an inyan of islapshus haseichel in the hand. Even in hiluch, there's islapshus haseichel. For instance, when a person dances, and he dances the way the dancing was done in the Beis Hamikdash by the Chachomim, and the way it's done, in fact, they have in amongst certain groups of Chassidim, they also have like mitzvah dance that the Rebbe does, and there's a certain amount of skill involved, and so on and so forth. Or even just to be able to follow a direction, that the legs lead you in the right direction. That means that the moichin or malumash in the legs to lead it in the right direction. But it's not like it is in the hands. The hands is much more refined and a much higher madrega of oil, as is explained elsewhere. Now we get to the head. The head, obviously, that's where the or hanefesh is at its most prominent. Even though when we're talking about the chayus hanefesh, you can't say that the head is more alive than the heart. The head was more alive in the heart, the person would probably die. But in other words, the person's equally alive everywhere. You can't say that one part of your body is more alive than the other. Yeah, that your head is more alive than your heart, or that your heart is more alive than your legs. The person's alive completely. Right? All of his goof is alive. It's not that part of him is dead. Nevertheless, we're not talking about the actual inyan of the etz and chayus, but we're talking about of the koichos. The koichos are more begilu in the moichin than there are in any other part of the body. That's what he goes on to say. Mikumakom, koichos, mikumakom, koichos einam shovim. When it comes to the koichos, they're not equal. In other words, the head and the heart and the legs are all on different madrigas. Why? Shahar beroish ugilu moichin, because in the roish is taka. That's the mamash, the mishkan of the moichin. That's where the ikka in the moichin is. Yes, it's true. You have amshot moichin in the legs also, and certainly in the hand. But nevertheless, the ikka in the moichin, certainly in the head, and that's where you have the chushim as well. All of the chushim are, or at least most of the chushim, are centered in the head: the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and so on. The only one that's not centered in the head is touch, and koyach hamishush is not as refined as koyach as koyach re'iyah, koyach shmiyah, and so on. In any event, so it turns out, therefore, of course, that the primary gilu of the nefesh is in the head, and the main concept of moichin is in the roish, even though the moichin is nimshach down into the spine, the medulla, from the medulla, and it's nimshach all the way into the spine. Nevertheless, in the spine, it's a very, it's much more dark than it is in the moyach. Obviously, it's much thinner, and much less mental capacity, obviously, in the medulla than there is in the two other spheres of the brain, the main spheres of the brain, right and left hemispheres. In the rusa de liba. Now he's going to ask a question about what about Rusa de Liba? Rusa de Liba, as we know, there's two inyanim in Rusa de Liba. Rusa de Liba could just be an inyan of the arousal of the heart, in other words, the arousal of the midah to a very high degree, at the arousal of the inyan of ahava, which is called Rusa de Liba, or it could be a koyach in ratzon, right? And that's usually, whenever we use the term, the expression Rusa de Liba, but derech klal, we mean it as a koyach in ratzon, and he's going to explain this. So what's in the rusa de liba shwinyan belev dafka? There's two types of rusa de liba. Aleph gumashe ba gamken all days, burning supermoyach. It comes about by way of contemplating, by way of thinking, meditating in the moyach, using the moichin. Raksha is going to see ba'orein sof shalamalmi ishtalshus. Only what? It's not just regular ahava, but it's a very high madrega in ahava, because the focus of the meditation was on madregas that are higher than the regular seder ishtalshus, and therefore it causes the emotion to transcend itself. In other words, transcend its kelim. That's why it's called ru'usa de liba, the arousal of the heart. In other words, the elevation of the heart up to a higher madrega. And I think he explains it in one of the Memorim in the famous Sefer Eter Tafresh Ayin. I think that's where it is, if I'm not mistaken. In any event, he continues, that's one form of Ru'us Deliba. The second form of Ru'us Deliba is in Ratzon itself. In other words, the Inyan of Ru'us Deliba mitzad the koyach or the koyches in keser. Beis yesh bo b'chinas Ru'us Deliba she'en holiday he's going in his cloud, doesn't come about through any type of meditation. Ki im mitzad etzem, it comes from the etzem of the person. What's the etzem of the person? The Inyan is Ratzon, koyach makifim of the nefesh. In other words, the etzem nefesh essentially. It transcends the Inyan of the regular koiches, the koiches that are melubash in kelim. The koiches are in the life, but this is not. This is transcendent. And this is a koich of the nefesh that is way beyond the inyonim of what can be misgali in the life. In the koiches nefesh itself, in other words, in the koiches that are melubash in kalim, the koiches that are melubash in the guf. In other words, when we're talking about his slabshus koiches, I'm not talking about koiches which are makifim. The koiches are melubash in the ikar koiches in the rosh. Why? Because that's the kalim in the rosh, the most refined kalim. It's not a kalim, but even a guf. The head we see is actually the smallest part of the body. I think they say that the head is like 1/8 or something in terms of weight. It's like 1/8 of the torso, maybe something like that. But anyway, it's a much, maybe it's not an 8, but I seem to recall that from somewhere. But in any event, the head is obviously much smaller than the torso. So why is it therefore that the head is where the Ikar Gilu is? Because it's as we were saying all of before, and this is why he brought us Mashal of the Guf. Because the smaller the Kli, the more the oil. The ore is the Kli is master on the ore. Therefore, the bigger the Kli, the more the ore is behelim. Mashayin over here, the smaller the Kli, the more the ore is bekilu. Now we could ask questions about that, but we'll come to that later on. Right? In terms of size, the torso is much bigger, and the legs are even bigger than that in terms of size. Because there's more of a kli when it comes to the legs and to the torso. When it comes to the oil, however, it's exactly the opposite. The oil in the rosh is much greater than the oil in the torso or in the legs. The baroish meir or nefesh beribu, the guf mismata or beregel mismait beyoisa, and in the legs the or is much less. Mokan hu b'dugmaila, and so to above. The gimel olam is biyah in the 3 worlds of biyah that we spoke about before. In other words, the olam is a klolim. And even in the olam is a protein, when we're talking about Bria, Yitzira, Nasiya protein. In other words, the regular Bria, Nasiya, and we'll transpose that shortly into the Indian of Bria the Chlaulis. In any event, the Gimel olam is Bia, the olam Bria, Meir Adayan, Gilo Or, Yosha, olam Bria. There's still an Indian of Or in olam Bria, because olam Bria, after all, is it's makabel from Atzilut, but although it's Yesh Mi'ayim, it's Yesh. But nevertheless, it's makabel from Atzilut. So ha'or, there's a dying gilu or in Olam Abriya. Yesh Olam Abriya hu hayesh harishon. It's the first yesh. Nivra ma'ayin eloki that was created yesh mi'ayin from Or Eloki. Meir sham adayin gilu ha'ayin. Therefore, the Indian of ayin, the Indian of Olam Atzilus is meir in Briya, at least to some extent. L'chein Abriya nikres choshech. Therefore, when we touch the tefillin, we say Yoitze Oyer, that's a tefillin shel Yad, corresponding to Elam HaYitzira. And Voirei Choshech is the tefillin shel Rosh. The tefillin shel Rosh are called Choshech because it's a higher madrega of Oyer, right? Yoitze Oyer, Voirei Choshech. Why is it on a higher madrega of Oyer? He explained. Behind Lefish, Bepriya, Meir, Gilo, Oyer, Hazibach is Choshech, Vehelem, Legabe Lamata. Because it's that kind of madrega of Oyer that is on such a high madrega that is bechinas choshech lamata. In Olam HaBriya is Bechinas Oyer. But in Olam HaAsiya, it's Bechinas Koisha because it's too high Olam HaDraga. In other words, the same thing you can understand by sound waves. Yeah, when you have sound waves in a lower pitch of sound waves, the sound waves are much bigger and much longer, and so on, and therefore they're audible. And the higher and higher pitch you go, all of a sudden it reaches a point at which, when the most energy there is in the oil, the higher the pitch, the more energy, it reaches a point at which you can't hear it anymore. Right? Why? Because it's transcended the ability for us to hear. It's such a high energy that you can't hear it anymore. It's beyond a very high pitch, and therefore it's beyond the capability of human ears to hear it, even though some animals may hear it and so on. But nevertheless, it's also the same kind of motion. That Olam HaBriya is in a choshech. It's higher than can be seen by the eye of the neshama living in Olam HaAsiya.
This is talking about Bria the Clolos, right?
The same thing is true of Bria. Same thing is true of Bria Bichlal.
Because there is a union of Chabad, and right, the Gemara time mitzvahs that comes from Bria, regular Bria. Why would it be Choshech?
It's called Choshech Legabe Olam HaAsiya because it's too high for Olam HaAsiya to grasp it. Whereas, of course, when you get to the union of the Chachomim, because they're on a regular Chochma, they can grasp it.
Right. Oba Mechashakim Hishivani, that's Talmudish Shibal.
That's Talmud Bab.
Oh, there we go.
There you go. Right?
That all fits.
Yes. Yetzira, she'ena or sham begiloi kol kach. In Yetzira, the or is not so much begiloi. It's much more begiloi. That's why we can say on the Tvinim Shel Yad, Yoetzer Oy. Masha'agin, the Tvinim Shel Oy, Shuvoy Rechosh. Mitzad HaKelim Hu Lahefech. The Bria Hu Bechinas Miut HaKelim. Yetzira Hu Ribu HaKelim. And it really goes together. That's what it is. The more Kelim there are, the more Helen there is. The fewer Kelim there are, the more Giloi or there is. Benaida, the Bria, oh no. Lost the mind. 1 second. I'll get back to it. Where we no test.
Samachan in this edition.
These computers are just not. Okay. Yeah. So we're saying Mitzad HaKelim Hu Lahefech. The Bria Bechinas Miut HaKelim, Yetziru Ribu HaKelim. The Yetzira Ayin Machshava V'Dibur. The Bria Yetzira Ayin Machshava V'Dibur. The Bria is called Olam HaMachshava, and Yetzira is called Olam HaDibur. Now, just in general, each one of the Olamis, there's one of the Partzufim. There's 5 Partzufim in every Olam. In other words, in the world of Atzilus, you have what are the Partzufim? Partzufim are spheroids, a cluster of spheroids that work in sort of relationships. They must be on each other. If you just look at the sphere is a certain quality, but it doesn't talk about the interaction. But the interaction, which is something that Arizal spoke about a lot, that's the whole inner of Islapshut, which is the Chidush of Arizal. There's Ishtaushulus, which the Ramakshtal spoke about. Then there's Islapshut, which was the Chidush of Arizal. And then there's the Chidush of the Baal Shem Tov, which is called Hashra'ah. A very, very interesting mimer from Yitzhak Isaac Mihomo, which I read something recently very interesting about Yitzhak Isaac Mihomo. After the Histalkus of the Mittler Rebbe, the Hasidim came to Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac Mihomo to become the Rebbe after the Mittler Rebbe. And he accepted. And then he had a dream, and the Alter Rebbe came to him in a dream and said, "Oh, whatever my grandson, or I don't know what the Loshon used over there. An Einikel, yeah, I think that's what he said. I intended it to be my grandson, and the Gadlus of Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac Mihomo is that he immediately took off the mantle. He took off the union of Rebbe, which he was worthy of, obviously, otherwise he wouldn't have been asked to become the Rebbe, and he passed it on to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he became a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, and one of the great chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek. That was the greatness of the Tzemach Tzedek. In any event, he writes in the Sefer called Maimar Shiflus V'Simcha. He writes that the three tekufas in the development of Kabbalah, the tekufa all the way through, right from the beginning through until the time of the Ramak, which focuses on explaining the inyan of Ishtalshlus. Then along comes the Arizal and explains the inyan of Islapshus. Islapshus is not just the spheroids, but the partsufim and the interaction. That's the inyan of Islapshus, the interaction of spheroids with one another, and therefore you don't call them spheroids, you call them partsufim. What's a partsuf? A partsuf is literally a visage. The partsufim are Arich Anpin, Abba Ve'ima, Abba Chochma, Ima Bina, Arich Anpin Keser, Zeir Anpin, that's a spheroid from Chesed to Yesoid, and Nukva, Malchus. And the way those partsufim work is like a family unit. There's the mother, there's the grandfather or the grandparents, right? And then there's the mother, and there's the father and the mother and the son and the daughter, right? The father, again, Abba, Chochma, the mother, Bina, Ima, and the son, Zeir Anpin, the 6 spheroids, and Malchus is Nukva. And they interact with each other just like there is interaction in a family sort of a setup. So there, that's really the inyan of the chidush. That's the chidush of the Arizal, and that's more or less what we're talking about here. The whole concept of Islapshus, where there's an inyan of kalim, and then there's an interaction between all of them, and that's why when we speak about Bria and Yetzirah, we talk about Machshova and Dibur. What is shoylet in Olam HaMachshova, in Olam HaBria? In Olam HaBria is the inyan of Ima, right? Ima corresponds to Bria. That Partzuf is the Ikar, even though all the Olamas each have 5 of the Partzufim, but the Ikar Partzuf in Olam HaBria is Ima, Bina, the inyan of understanding, right? The Ikar inyan of Atzilus is Chochma. And then Zeir Anpin is Yetzirah, which is what he explains here, the inyan of Dibur. In other words, the Hisgalus of the Midois through Dibur. And then finally comes Olam HaSiyah, which is the inyan of Malchus, the inyan of Maisa. In any event, so Machshova and Dibur would be Bria and Yetzirah. Those 2 partsufim of Ima and Zeir Anpin. Anu roim the Mashem Machashev b'Machshova b'miut man b'miut oisius. What a person can think of in his Machshova in a very short period of time, and with very few oisius. Dibur, Baber, Dibur, Beribuzman. The Beribo oisius comes in Dibur in a very long time. In fact, that's they explain that in the time of Mashiach, that our limud will be in a limud of Re'iyah, a limud of Machshova, not a limud of Dibur. The problem with Dibur is it's linear and it takes a long time. You have to say one word after the other. Mashiach and Re'iyah, you pick it at once. So when we learn Torah in the future, and that's they say there are those that very well. They say that the Rebbe, when he learned the Gemara, the Rebbe took in the whole daf all at once. That's why he was able to learn 7 daf a day, just of Talmud Bavli, and then he told you Talmud Yerushalmi and 3 Prokim Rambam and the Chassidus. Why? Because it was Bechinas Re'iyah. He saw the whole daf all at once. It didn't need to go like through word by word kind of thing. That's a koyach that obviously most of us don't have.
So Dibur is Yetzirah, not Malchus, right? No. Which is normally.
Yeah, because Torah. How's it called? Torah Bal Peh Karin La. Yeah, Malchus Peh. Torah Bal Peh Karin La. You're right. Malchus is generally called Peh, but here when we talk about the partsufim, the partsuf of Dibur, the partsuf of Zeir Anpin, which is the Olam HaYetzirah. Right, Mash Einkein, when it comes to Malchus, Asiyah.
The pot has to be washed. It's dirty.
Both of them.
That's right. Well, I looked at it tonight. It's dirty. Okay.
All right. Now he goes on to then explains also the inyan of oisis hamachshova. V'gam oisis hamachshova hein oisis ruchanim. The ruchniim, the letters of thought are much more ruchni than the oisis of than the oasis of dibur, and therefore enon magishim, enon mugrashim rather el hazulas. They're not felt by somebody else, but they're not felt by somebody else. And there are those obviously those people who have the talent to be able to read other people's machshavos. The Arizal was certainly one of them, and he was a davar yadua that the Arizal could read a person's machshavos just by looking at his face, and sometimes not even by looking at it.
And we're talking about voices that are above the language, right?
I think we're not talking about this above language. Yeah, oasis a re'iyah, oasis a machshava. I don't know if oasis are. It's an interesting question whether oasis Eliezer is asking whether oasis are machshava or oasis that transcend language, or does one think in languages? Now, I don't know how most people think. Some people, it seems, think in words, and some people think in pictures.
Well, but in Tanya, they mentioned, right, that there are two madrigas.
Yes.
So this is that's talking about the higher
the
one.
higher madriga, yeah.
That's why you could read people's thoughts regardless of the language, basically.
Yes, yeah, right. Yeah, but it's an interesting thing, and there's a lot of discussion about this actually in modern scientific things about whether whether people actually think in pictures. They dream in pictures. They don't usually dream in words. People dream in pictures usually. But whether thought is, now it depends. It would seem that a person whose nefesh is a nefesh of chokhmah, he won't think in words. He'll think in pictures. Masha'en kind of neshama bebina, they will think much more in terms of. And certainly, a person in the madriga of Malchus was certainly thinking words and so on. But it's an interesting thing. There are people who think in pictures. As far as I remember correctly,
Can be responsible for stuff.
you the entire Tanya will appear just word perfect. Forget, but anyway, apparently you saw that. All right. Masha'enkan oasis adibur hen murgoshim el azulas, but words of speech are felt by other people. More kain because the kain of the bria, similarly the kain of the bria are hen beginners mute. The gabi the kain down below, but mute a kain. The hainu mute hayeshus mahamitzius. Whereas in Yetzira, who beginners ribu hakain. That's why in Yetzir, which corresponds here in this case to Dibur, there's Ribui HaDibur in order to express an idea that you see that takes you one moment to see in your mind, can take you, as the Gemara says, it can take you 80 years to express what you saw in one picture in your mind. This is why Yecheskel, when he speaks about the Merkava, he goes on for a whole chapter, right? Yeshaya and Marich Kokach, and Yeshaya says a few psukim, right? He also speaks about the Merkava. What's the difference? That Yeshaya saw the Merkava in Olam HaPriya, and Yecheskel saw the Merkava in Olam HaYetzira, and Zechariah saw the Merkava in Olam HaAsiyah. Behind with Nesh Yecheskel ras the Merkava the Olam HaYetzira. He saw the Olam HaYetzira. Is Rigo HaKelim. Okay, Marich Ba'inyan, and therefore he speaks about it at great length. Yeshaya Ram Merkava the Bria. Is Miut HaKelim. A much higher level, and therefore Miut HaKelim, which is the theme that he's going with now, that the more Kelim there are, the more Helam Be'ester there are. And really that's true to a certain extent. In other words, when you hear a shir from your Rav, you're learning Gemara, you're learning an Inyan, right? And you don't understand, so you have to have ribui diburim, ribui biurim, in order to be able to understand the Inyan. Once a person understands the Inyan, he grasps the core of the Inyan, the dibur doesn't matter how you express it in different words, it really is irrelevant, because it can be expressed in these words, it can be expressed in those words. All the words are chitzonius ha'inyan, they're not the primius ha'inyan. To get to the primius ha'inyan, that's the word, that's the trick, so to speak, in getting to the depth of an inyan. Mitzada or adarabba, but bria may ribo or bitzira mismaita or. One thing really depends on the other. The more the or, the fewer the kalim, or the other way around. He says the shakalim, the shakalim haim b'chinas mute, shain kalim yoiser el haor. Therefore, they're more of a kli for the or. In other words, me'er sham riboy haor. Ribu hakalim, but when there's lots of kalim, is ma'at or the or is reduced. That's the way it is. The more kalim, the less or. The more you have to speak it out, the less people understand. We see that by Rashi as well. Rashi is Mefarish the Gemara. Rashi is Mefarish in a few lines, like in a few words rather, what it takes others to be Mefarish, or the same thing in Chumash, what it takes others to be Mefarish in like sentences, and they don't get it out as clearly as Rashi. Right? Why? Because he had that chokhmah to be able to put things in a very small kli. It was coming from a higher madrega. V'gam klalus ha'olam is nechlokim legim madregas klolim. And so too, the oilamists themselves can also be divided. All of the oilamists can be divided into three general madregas, which are called Adam the Bria, that's Adam Kadmoin. Adam Kadmoin, the first oilam before oilam Atzilus. Adam the Yetzira, that's oilam Atzilus. And Adam the Asiya, that's Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Again, Adam the Bria, the Klalus for Adam the Yetzira, Adam the Asiya, etc. Okay, Kitzu. וכמו יש חלקוס במעלה ומטה באוילמס, just as there's חלקוס במעלה ומטה, כמו באדם הראש הוא כלי קטנה, the ראש is a much smaller than the rest of the body, it's a כלי קטן, ובא גילוי הכוח is נעלים שבנפש, and there you're finding the most גילויים from the nefesh. Guf, Godel, the guf is much bigger, in other words, the torso is much bigger, ubo mishkan amidos. The koiches chitonium and the koiches, for instance, in the hand. And he says that there is an exception to the inner rus of the liba. Rus of the liba that comes through his boinanus, or shezeu atmi rus of the liba, an emotion that can actually come from ratzon, as we explained before. But nevertheless, to go back to the main subject, the regel miuta or in the regel in the leg, you have much less oil than you have even in the torso, in the legs. More can be bria, so too in the oilers. But bria, kalim, and with metzius adain, meir gilo oil, because the kalim are not such a metzius yet in olam bria. Therefore, there's much more oil in olam bria. Be'etzira shakalim metzius umiut oil. Therefore, it's much less oil because of the yeshus of the kalim. And this corresponds also to machshava and dibu. Machshava would be olam bria, dibu olam yetzira. L'chein Yecheskel herich be'inyan makava. Yecheskel, when he spoke about the Makava, took all the chapter, and Yeshaya did not. Much shorter, much briefer. Kainhu b'bia ha'klolim, and so too when it comes to bia ha'klolim, bria the chlalus is olam aran kadmoy, and that's riboy or Masha'in kain asiya the chlalus, that's the olamus of bria yitzira and asiya, and yitzira the chlalus olam atzilus. Okay, that will be chapter 35. Shukayach. And see you actually next week. We won't see you next week. Next week is Tisha B'Av, and obviously we won't have a shiur on Tisha B'Av. Bezos Hashem.